I didn't even know she had them.
Good morning, everyone. How are you guys doing today? Please drop your comments in the chat so we can know who is excited to be here, a part of this webinar on behalf of all of the partners that we have on the screen. The Alliance for the Bay, the Maryland Counties, NACO, VML, VACO, Chesapeake Bay, LGAC, and a host of others. We want to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules this morning to join us to talk about infrastructure investment and the Jobs Act. This is kind of like a part 2 to webinar series that the local government committee for the Chesapeake Bay has organized in partnership with the Chesapeake Bay staff and Alliance to make sure that we connect with you to share information regarding how we can make investments in our water infrastructure. As a reminder, we'll ask all of our chat participants to please drop it. Yeah, you're already doing it. Joanne Williamsburg, City of Petersburg, nice to see you up the street from me. All of the people joining us today, please share where you are in the chat so we can get a perspective of who is joining us today. As another matter of housekeeping, please remember if you have questions to enter them into the Q&A function. The Q&A function is located at the bottom of your screen. Q&A. Inside of there, it will list your questions in order of when they're received. At the end of the webinar, we will go back to them to make sure we have answered your questions. So please do not put your questions in the chat, put them in the Q&A function. I'll be monitoring the chat box to make sure that everyone is interacting, but most importantly, remembering to put their questions in the correct spot so we don't lose track of the important information that we want to share with you. I haven't introduced myself as of yet. My name is Jasmine Gore. I am the chair for LGAC, which is a local government advisory committee to the Executive Council of the Chesapeake Bay. Yes, that is a mouthful. So for right now, we're just going to call ourselves LGAC. We are a group of elected officials who have been appointed by our respective governors, and in the case of Washington, D.C., by the mayor of D.C. We are the voice of local elected officials along the Chesapeake Bay watershed to promote water investment and other needs to promote clean water for recreational use, drinking, stormwater, all the things that matter important to us in the municipal arena. The purpose of today's webinar is to provide information on the opportunity to invest in water infrastructure using state revolving funds and other opportunities for attendees to share information in regards to the projects that we're all working on to address longstanding water infrastructure needs. We do have a guest with us today. We would like to introduce, I believe she's on the line, Dr. Candace Boyd. I believe she's here. So Dr. Candace Boyd is the new EPA Chesapeake Bay Program Administrator. She's new to the Bay as a director, and she is an expert and advocate for science, technology, engineering, and arts and math. In our world, we know that as STEM. Dr. Boyd will share her thoughts on the watershed infrastructure and investment program. Dr. Boyd, are you on the line right now?
I am on the line. Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Awesome, awesome. Thank you so much, Jasmine. I really appreciate the warm words, and good morning, everybody. Would you like me to go ahead and start with some opening remarks?
Absolutely, please do.
Awesome, awesome. All right. Well, first of all, thank you. Thank you to everyone for inviting me to participate in this webinar. And so, as Jasmine mentioned, I'm here in my capacity as the Chesapeake Bay Program Director, but also on behalf of our colleagues in EPA Region 3, which executes the EPA programs for the Mid-Atlantic region, and that includes the State Revolving Fund Program. So what am I here to talk to you about today? As you undoubtedly know, the Chesapeake Bay Program was included in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. Sometimes we call that the bill or the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. So I'll talk to you a little bit about that, but I'm also really happy to talk to you about the infrastructure law and then how it will help our partnerships, especially for the Chesapeake Bay, but also for the watershed as well, which, as you know, stretches across 6 states and also the District of Columbia. So as we will learn more today, there's also significant increases in the state revolving funds that will impact our entire nation, our region, as well as the Chesapeake Bay and the watershed. So overall, the bill, the bilateral infrastructure law, it's a once in a generation investment that will create millions of jobs, modernizing our infrastructure. It will turn climate crises into an opportunity, and it'll also support the health, the equity, and then also just the resilience of many of our communities. So the law will invest more than $50 billion over the next 5 years to improve our nation's drinking water, our wastewater, as well as our storm infrastructure. So this is the largest federal investment in water infrastructure in our nation's history. So let's talk about the Chesapeake Bay Program. So I'm grateful, as well as our leadership team. I see we have some members who are here today who are participating. And so on behalf of the entire office, we're just really grateful to the congressional appropriators that we have received $283 million over 5 years to support the Chesapeake Bay Program directly. And so I think that in itself deserves like a round of applause, some hand claps, and just a time to just really, really celebrate. So we've already allocated $40 million to small watersheds, to innovative nutrient and sediment reduction grants, also to grants to jurisdictions that are targeted for our most effective basins. And so in order to remove some of those barriers and then also ensure that we have equitable access to these funds, EPA is waiving the match requirements for these programs in 2022. So as we continue to move forward with this, we're really grateful for the obvious support that we've received. And I also want to offer a huge thank you to everyone involved in this partnership for all that you do to protect and restore the Chesapeake Bay as well as the watershed. So as I mentioned, we're really happy for our support. We really feel it from this group as well as others. And we have 64,000 square miles to work on for our watershed. So that's no small feat, but as they say, many hands make light work. So I'm really happy to support the 18 million plus people who call the Chesapeake Bay and the watershed home. So those state revolving funds. So obviously we're here to talk to you, everyone today about that. And then also the clean water, as well as the drinking water state revolving funds. There's $43 billion combined that have been added over the past 5 years. So here's another statistic. In FY22 alone, our region, Mid-Atlantic, Region 3, we awarded nearly $720 million in infrastructure funds and $205 million in the clean water SRF, as well as $514 million in the drinking water SRF. So that's on top of the FY22 base SRF appropriation, and that was $194 million. So I know those are a lot of numbers, but I know we'll probably break those down as well. So also, I just want to highlight that a part of our watershed actually falls in Region 2, which is in New York. They've also received large increases as a result of the infrastructure law. So we want to take a moment and celebrate that as well. So I just want to make sure that I emphasize that almost half of the infrastructure FRS money will be available as fully forgivable loans and grants. So this will enable overburdened and under-resourced communities who have struggled to compete for or even receive federal loans to have an equitable seat at the table and also to receive their fair share of funding. So as I wrap up today, again, thank you so much for the invitation. I really appreciate having the opportunity to speak today. And I just want to emphasize that through the infrastructure funding, as well as the SRF programs, we've had a tremendous opportunity to leverage a lot of resources to focus our efforts and actions on restoring the Chesapeake Bay, as well as the local waters that connect to it. So our hope is to bolster the communities, to accelerate various aspects of the economy. And we want to just make sure that we rely on focusing on a healthy, resilient Chesapeake Bay watershed. So I think these are exciting times, as you can tell by the energy in my voice. I can't wait to meet and interact with so many of you in the coming days and weeks. And I'm really excited for the partnership. So as I said before, many hands make light work. So I know that together we can move forward, move the needle forward, accelerate, and ultimately make a difference in the Bay. So thank you again. Those are my remarks for this morning. I'll turn it back over to Jasmine. And again, this is a great opportunity, and I know we will tackle this together. So thank you.
Thank you so much for your warm introduction and joining us today. We are going to jump right into our first presentation, and it's going to be organized through Maggie Cunningham. She is the Regional Clean Water State Revolving Fund Coordinator with the EPA.
Thank you, Jasmine. Good morning, everyone. As Jasmine just said, I am the Clean Water State Revolving Fund and the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund Coordinator in EPA Region 3. Right? And thank you so much for giving me some time on your agenda today. And feel free to type in your questions in the Q&A box. I will get to them during the rest of the agenda today. So now, just to make sure there's no confusion, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act is the official title of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. It's just bill is a lot easier to say than IIJA. So we have been referring to it as bill. And as Candace said, it is the largest ever investment in our nation's water infrastructure to address climate change and public health. All right. So a quick overview of the law itself. It was passed in November 21. It is both an authorization statute and an appropriation statute. As an authorization statute, that means bill creates new programs and it changes the requirements of several existing programs. Now, one such major change is the Build America, Buy American Act, which establishes new domestic preference requirements for programs or federal grant funding to construction projects. All right. So, all right. Now, the unique thing about the bill's appropriations portion is that it is 5 years of actual funding. And that's as opposed to our normal annual appropriations for grant programs. This allows better planning in order to achieve the bill goals, because we know the money will be there next year and how much of it will be available. So, all right, slide 3, thank you. 60 billion is how much, no, stay on one slide back. Sorry, all right, 60 billion. All right. The nice big pie is showing how much 60.8 billion actually is coming to EPA over the next 5 years. All right. There's a little piece for brownfields, which is a little piece, 5.3 billion. There's 5 billion for cleaner school buses. There's 100 million for pollution prevention. Obviously, the big slice is the 50.4 billion for all water infrastructure programs, and that includes the Chesapeake Bay grants as well as the SRF grant programs. Okay, next slide. All right, drilling down into the large bluer slice. All right, there's funding for each one of these programs: the Clean Water State Revolving Fund, Drinking Water State Revolving Fund, the Underground Injection Control Grants, the Chesapeake Bay Program, National Estuary Programs. There's also small and disadvantaged community assistance grants for emerging contaminants as well. All right, next slide. I want to talk mostly today about the SRFs. All right, the SRF programs are a federal state partnership that provides low-cost financing to communities for drinking water, wastewater, stormwater, and non-point source infrastructure projects. The SRFs are 30-year-old federal state partnerships. So they are the 2 largest grant programs at EPA. Even before you included all the bill funding, the 2 SRFs were still the largest at EPA. For many years, EPA has awarded an annual Drinking Water SRF and an annual Clean Water SRF grant to each state, including the District of Columbia. The state provides the required federal match, not the local communities. All right, that's very important. The loans are at very low interest rates and have very flexible repayment terms. So for wastewater and stormwater projects, there can be up to 30 years for a disadvantaged community to repay their loan. For drinking water projects, there can be up to 40 years for a disadvantaged community to repay their loan. Now, although we were fundamentally a loan program, beginning in 2010, Congress has authorized states to provide a portion of each of the new federal grants as loan forgiveness or subgrants. All right. To be very clear, that's the amount of money that does not have to be repaid. All right. Now, this loan forgiveness is predominantly targeted to disadvantaged communities, both urban and rural communities. All right. Next slide, please. All right. All right. This slide in a picture shows how the SRF programs work. In the center is the state agency that manages the SRF. Right? EPA awards a grant each year, and the state legislature provides the required match. The state then awards loans with or without principal forgiveness to construct various types of eligible water infrastructure projects. Right? After construction is complete, the borrower begins to repay the loan over their amortization period. The money revolves at the state. The repayments do not go back to EPA. Right? This is very important because that means the money that stays at the state is now state money, not federal money. So all SRF projects are state projects, not EPA projects. And as a result, the SRF loans can be used to match other federal grants. So sometimes when a state does not have enough money available to fund all projects, that state can issue bonds. That's the picture down at the bottom, bondholders. The state can issue bonds to raise even additional funding. And those bonds do need to be repaid over time. All right, next slide, please. All right. These amounts are in the millions of dollars. This is last year, pre-bill. All right. And this slide demonstrates the revolving nature of the SRFs. Last year, we gave clean water SRF grants, for example, in Delaware. EPA gave the state of Delaware $7.8 million as a clean water grant and $11 million for a drinking water grant. But the state needs to combine that money with all the repayments that they've received from prior years, from all the prior year loans that they've made, so that Delaware had $26 million available to make new loans for clean water, and they had $20.8 million available to make new drinking water loans. All right. Now, the District of Columbia is a little unique in EPA Region 3. They do not actually have an SRF that revolves. They just get an annual allotment, similar to Delaware's amounts. All right. Next slide. Okay. I call this the Srf Build Buckets. To understand what Bill is doing to the two Srf programs, we're getting the money in 5 separate buckets. And all of the bill money, keep in mind, is in addition to our regular annual base program. Right? So the first 2 buckets are the general supplemental, and I'm sorry if that print is too small, but the general supplemental buckets, the white water drop with the blue background. Right. This funding can be used for any existing eligible SRF project. Right. There is a 10% state match on this bucket. Right. And again, that is not for the borrowers to worry about or the local utilities or governments. Right. The states must provide 49% of this money as loan forgiveness or grants to their communities. Okay. The next 2 buckets are emerging contaminants. This is funding that's used to address emerging contaminants, and there is no state match required on this money, and 100% of it must be given as loan forgiveness. Right. For the drinking water projects, these funds are targeted to infrastructure projects that address PFAS. Right? In the clean water, these funds may be used for projects that address PFAS, microplastics, pharmaceuticals, and other contaminants of concern. Right? The 5th bucket is only available in the drinking water SRF because it is specifically targeted for removing lead service lines. Right? Next slide, please. Oh, I'm sorry. And the lead service line money is also 100% principal forgiveness. So, all right. So here we go. In a nice, pretty picture, if you look down the y-axis of the grant, these are the Srf programs in EPA Region 3. The purple bar is the base program grant for federal fiscal year 2022. Right. Now, remember, this is just the EPA grant. It is not the state match, and it is not the money that is available from repayments. This is just the EPA grants being shown on this slide. The light blue is the general supplemental bucket. Again, that can be used for any eligible project. And the medium blue is the emerging contaminant bucket, And the dark blue, which is only available in the drinking water SRF, is for the lead service line replacements. So you can see pictorially just how much more money is available in the SRF programs right now. Next slide, please. All right. This slide just gives you the exact dollar amounts that were shown in the graph in case you were interested, right? But with this historic increase of funding from Bill, especially with the substantial increase in the loan forgiveness amounts that are available for disadvantaged communities, the SRF programs have the capacity to fund many more infrastructure projects that address climate change, promote resiliency throughout the region, replace failing infrastructure. So we are really hoping that communities will take advantage of this opportunity. Right. Next slide, please. Right. Some of the key features with SRF financing. Right. There, again, no match or cost share for the local borrower. All right. Funds can be used to match other federal grants. Right. Credits are retained by the borrower. So, for example, a lot of infrastructure projects can generate nutrient credits or carbon credits. And the revenue that a borrower can obtain by selling those credits is retained by the borrower. Of course, it can be used as part of repaying their loan, but it doesn't have to be. Okay. Invoices are paid quickly. The SRF program is a reimbursement program. So you incur the cost, you invoice the cost to the state SRF, and they pay those invoices. The states are required to pay those invoices, provided there's supportable documentation, within 45 days. And most of the states, at least in Region 3, are normally under 30 days for paying invoices. Next, repayment is delayed 1 year. So you complete construction, you have 1 year before you have to begin repaying the loan. There are flexible repayment terms, and loans are required by statute to be at below market rates. Next slide, please. Okay. To be eligible for SRF financing, there must be both an eligible borrower and an eligible project. This is a list of the general types of projects that the Clean Water SRF can fund. It is not an all-inclusive list. If you ever have any doubt, please contact me, contact your state SRF to make sure that the project you have in mind is eligible. There's also a list of borrowers that are eligible under the Clean Water SRF. Next slide, please. This is a list of the drinking water SRF eligibilities. Okay. It's a little bit short of a list. The other thing is the borrowers must be a community water system or a nonprofit, non-community water system to be eligible for a drinking water SRF loan. Right. This is a picture of a handbook. I have a slide at the end that includes links to resources where you can access this handbook. There is a similar eligibility handbook for a Clean Water SRF if you'd like to go and contact. But then the easiest thing to do is just contact your state SRF and they'll talk to you about what project you have in mind to make sure that it's eligible. All right. Next slide, please. Okay. What types of costs are eligible? All right. Here's a list of the eligible costs and then some examples of ineligible costs. All right. The SRFs are a source for infrastructure financing. Therefore, operations and maintenance types of costs are not eligible. All right. Costs to conduct water quality sampling or testing as part of planning or designing a project is eligible. Right. However, the continuous routine monitoring that needs to be done at drinking water and wastewater treatment plants is thought to be routine operation and maintenance and not an eligible SRF. So there is a distinction there. If purchasing a large piece of equipment, right, the equipment itself is SRF eligible, but the SRF cannot pay for the operator of that equipment or the gasoline to run it. I hope that that's clear. Next slide, please. Okay, all right. Some final points here to keep in mind about the SRF program. All right, they are fundamentally state programs. States set their own priority ranking systems, and the states set their own definitions for disadvantaged communities. The states are required to put together what's called an intended use plan each year that tells EPA and the public how much money they have available that year and what projects they expect or plan to fund with that money. The definitions for a disadvantaged community and their priority ranking criteria are included as part of those intended use plans. Those IUPs are available for public comment every year. All right. So, and it's important to understand that it's the project that's ranked, not the community. All right. The projects are funded in priority order. All right. But once a project is identified for funding, the financing terms are set for that individual borrower based on the borrower's affordability criteria, based on the state's affordability criteria and the borrower's affordability situation. All right. So what gets adjusted is the repayment terms, the repayment years, the interest rate, and then any loan forgiveness that's available can also be applied to that community. All right. Next slide, please. So here are the links, and my slides are going to be shared to the Drinking Water SRF Eligibility Handbook, the Clean Water SRF, it's called Overview of Eligibilities. Those documents are also available on EPA's website at epa.gov, Clean Water SRF, and Drinking Water SRF. These last two links will get you right to the list of your state contact and your state's website. Okay. And the final link there is EPA headquarters link for everything related to the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. Okay. Last slide. And of course, you can always contact me. I go by Maggie, but you need the name Magdalene in order to get an email to me. So that's all I have, Jasmine. And I will take a look at the Q&A box and answer any questions that are in there now.
Thank you so much for your presentation. For everyone that is watching, please again use the Q&A box to answer your questions in so we can go back and address them at the end of the presentation. As Maggie mentioned, she is the EPA Region 3 Administrator, which includes DC, Delaware, Maryland, Pennsylvania, Virginia, and West Virginia. I forgot to mention that she has worked for the EPA for over 35 years, including the last 20 years as a state revolving funds point of contact. And so she runs the largest grant program under the EPA. And so we're grateful to have her on the line today. So please utilize this opportunity to hear directly from the expert in regards to how you can utilize this. Up next, we have two other presenters. We have the Legislative Director of Sustainability with the National League of Cities and the Associate Legislative Director of Environment, Energy, and Land Use with the National Association of Counties. Ms. Carolyn and Sarah, you guys on the line today?
Hello, thank you, Jasmine. Yep, should we start?
Yeah, I just want to mention one thing. Carolyn leads the NLC's advocacy, regulatory, and policy efforts on energy and environmental issues, while Sarah works with the county officials across the nation to set organizational priorities and policies for the environment, energy, and land use issues that affect them both. I just wanted to make sure I let everybody know exactly who is going to be presenting to them today so they can understand the great vast knowledge that we have on the line. Again, to please use the Q&A function to drop in your questions, interact with everyone while you're in the chat feature. We're watching to see if people have questions to make sure we do not miss them at all. And LGAC staff have also commented in regards to the presentation. So you guys will get this after today's webinar. So just be prepared to check your emails after today's webinar to get all this other information. I'll pass it over to you, and thank you again for joining us this morning.
Okay, we can go to the next slide, and I think Sarah is going to kick us off.
So I'll just jump right in. So as we heard about before from Dr. Boyd, President Biden signed the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act into law on November 15th, 2021. And as we said before, you probably heard this piece of legislation referred to by a number of names, but today I think we're going to kind of keep it simple and call it Bill, or the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. So Bill provides a $1.2 trillion over 5 years, including $550 billion in new investments for all modes of transportation, water, power and energy, environmental remediation, public lands, broadband and resiliency, a whole host of things. But it also really provides historic access for local governments to federal infrastructure programs, with a lot of the funding flowing directly to cities and counties, including 30% of the federal transportation dollars. And this is really the type of access to funds that NACO and NLC have been advocating for years. And the amount of funds made available for local governments really provides a unique opportunity for cities and counties across the country to make transformational investments in their infrastructure. And so we're about 8 months into what's really a 5-year timeline to put these dollars to work. And so today, Carolyn and I are going to talk a little bit about how local governments can start to strategize to make the most of these next 5 years. Next slide.
I think I'll just keep on mute because we're going to be going back and forth here. So this is really about a partnership between local, regional, and state leadership. And as local leaders, you understand the infrastructure needs on the ground in your community better than anyone. This is your opportunity to act as that coordinator between the federal government and your community. And in order to do that, you first need to understand what are the programs that will meet your local infrastructure goals, and how do you prioritize those and know and understand how to access them. And secondly, you need to plan and prepare in order to be successful for this. So again, this is just a tremendous opportunity for partnership at the local and regional level to maximize the benefits of these programs. Next slide.
So just to take a bit of a step back to look at all the different investments Bill makes in different sectors. So like I mentioned before, Bill provides about $550 billion in new investments. A majority of these funds, as you can see from the graphic, go towards transportation. But there's also a significant amount of funding included for water infrastructure, about $65 billion in total, with about $50.4 billion, as Dr. Boyd said, that headed towards EPA for water infrastructure programs. And a few other items of note, you can see there's also significant funding for resiliency, a lot of that going towards FEMA for things like flood mitigation and the Storm Act and the BRIC program. And then there's also funding in there for environmental remediation, including about $1.2 billion over the life of the bill for brownfields. And also, I think could be of interest, there's about $17 billion in there for ports and waterways, including funding for the Port Infrastructure Development Program. So I encourage you to sort of look at all the different pieces of funding that are available to you from Bill, using resources from EPA itself or on NACO's website or NLC's website to sort of see what's out there and get a better picture of this really massive amount of funding. Next slide.
So this is a little bit of a repeat, but we'll talk about it anyways, because I think it's helpful to hear it in a couple of different ways. There are 4 major buckets for water infrastructure coming out of EPA, and they're all running through the SRF programs. So we've got $11.7 billion each for the Clean Water State Revolving Fund and the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund. And this is over 5 years in addition to the annual appropriations process and amounts. And there was a question in the chat. Yes, it is anticipated that Congress will still provide that annual appropriations. There's 15 billion over 5 years for lead pipe removal and replacement. What's unique here is that this is also flowing through the drinking water SRF, which is not something that has been done before. And finally, bill provides 10 billion to address PFAS contamination in drinking water and other emerging contaminants. And this money is flowing through both the drinking water and clean water state revolving funds, which is also new. So for the traditional clean water and drinking water state revolving funds and for the lead pipe replacement funds, and I saw a question, I think, in the chat about this, bill provides 49% of that must be given out from the states as principal forgiveness or grants. And that means 51% will go out from the states as loans. And so this is not true for the PFAS and emerging contaminants funding, which the state is required to give out as 10% grants. So just for comparison, with the annual appropriations dollars that come to the Clean Water and Drinking Water State Revolving Fund, the states are only required to give out 10% as principal forgiveness or grants. So this is definitely an increase in that amount in those communities that will be able to take advantage of that. How do you access this fund? These funds, you heard from this about this from Maggie, and I think the next panel will dive into state-specific information. I do want to emphasize again, I think Maggie mentioned the memo from EPA to the states on the SRFs, how that money should be given out. I would encourage you to take a look at that. It's really helpful to kind of know what to expect from your state agency. It also lays out the exact dollar amounts that your state will get in FY22, including the amount of that 49% that must be given out as the principal forgiveness or grants. And then I also want to mention, as Dr. Boyd said, the pot of money for EPA for all of the geographic programs, and it's 238 million on the EPA Chesapeake Bay Program for pollution reduction grants. And we can go to the next slide.
So just to provide a bit of background on what the Clean Water SRF funds can be used for, so that you all can start to think about different kinds of projects that you want to prioritize, as Maggie talked about before, under the Clean Water SRF program, and the SRF programs general, EPA makes grants to states to capitalize revolving funds that are then administered by the states, and the states use that capitalization grant while also providing the 20% match to provide loans for wastewater projects. But for the bill funding in particular, 49% of the state's capitalization grant has to be used to provide fully forgivable loans. And then for the emerging contaminants piece of the Clean Water SRF, states have to use their entire allotment to provide fully forgivable loans. So that's just another thing to keep in mind. And again, as Carolyn mentioned, these bill funds are on top of the regular appropriations for the SRF. I believe the Clean Water SRF got about $1.64 billion in the FY 2022 appropriations process. But just to turn to project eligibilities, there are 11 types of projects that are eligible under the Clean Water SRF to receive assistance. These include the construction of publicly owned treatment works, so assistance to any municipality or intermunicipal, interstate, or state agency for the construction of publicly owned treatment works, non-point source project, National Estuary Program projects, decentralized wastewater treatment systems. Next slide. Stormwater projects, so anything to manage, reduce, treat, or recapture stormwater or subsurface drainage water, water conservation, efficiency, and reuse. Watershed pilot projects, energy efficiency, so like reducing energy consumption needs from these publicly owned treatment works. Next slide. Water reuse, security measures of publicly owned treatment works, and also for technical assistance. And we'll also be sure to share these slides following the presentation so you can take a closer look at these eligibilities as well. Next slide.
Okay, great. So on the drinking water SRF, it covers planning, design, and building or upgrading of drinking water systems, basically projects that will help you meet the requirements of the Safe Drinking Water Act. There are 6 specific project categories. These include treatment, transmission and distribution, source water protection, water storage, consolidation, and creation of new systems. And I want to emphasize also what Maggie said. She linked to the Clean Water and Drinking Water SRF eligibility guidance documents. Those are really great documents where you can, especially as you're thinking about using ARPA funds for SRF, because those are funds that you as local leaders control which projects you're going to put towards that. So they're really great documents to see, is your project eligible? It will lay out all of these different categories. We can go to the next slide. So what we wanted to do is just give some examples. I know all of you in your communities have probably a long list of water infrastructure projects, but just wanted to highlight here a few that we found. And these links here are to the Aquarius and Pisces awards, project awards from EPA, just to give you some examples. So under the clean water side, we have Baltimore City and Baltimore County received 368 clean water SRF loan, 368 million clean water SRF loan to increase capacity at the water treatment plant to be able to handle excess flows that typically come into the plant during heavy rains. The project will eliminate up to 80% of the city's sanitary sewer overflows and reduce the incidence of basement backups for residents.
And then just for a county example on the clean water SRF end, that's going to be LaGrange County in Indiana. So that's the LaGrange County Regional Utility District received about $15.6 million to construct a new wastewater treatment plant that will allow for the wastewater collection and treatment to residential, commercial, and industrial users. It also allowed for some sewer extensions to be installed in unincorporated areas, as well as the construction of new sewer systems. It also allows for the elimination of 365 household and 49 commercial septic tanks. And it will connect these homes and entities to a new wastewater system. And I want to highlight that, you know, while it was the utility district that received the grant, it's often the case for these projects where it's a community-wide effort. And, you know, the County Regional Development Commission, the county itself also provided funding to support the project.
On the drinking water side, the town of Milton, Delaware conducted a study of sea level rise in public facilities that were at risk and determined that a Category 4 hurricane with a high tide surge would put their water treatment plant at risk. So to address this, they received a drinking water SRF loan for water main extension, well and treatment facility construction, failing water main replacements. The project created a loop in the water system, which increased their resiliency and improved water quality for the town's 200 households.
And then, on the county side, there's Trumbull County in Ohio. They received about $15 million in drinking water SRF funding, in addition to some local and CDBG funds to help consolidate a few small public water systems into one regional entity. So in the area, there's one community that had a wastewater treatment plant that was past its useful life, and its water source was being impacted by harmful algal blooms and other contaminants. And then a second community in the area that didn't have a public water system. And actually the mobile home park in the area was relying on a hauled in drinking water system. So the county ended up extending its water mains to these two communities, ultimately providing safe drinking water to over 1,200 residents and businesses. And the project also involved the construction of a water transmission and distribution system that consolidated and brought in several other smaller public water systems into one sort of overarching regional entity, bringing and helping areas that didn't have access to public water before. Next slide.
Okay, I wanted to touch on two of the other SRFs and give a little bit more examples on what these two funding pots can be used from. So first is lead pipe removal. The funding is for lead service line replacement projects and associated activities directly connected to the identification, planning, design, and replacement of lead service lines. While inventories do not need to be completed before the lead service line replacement begins, EPA strongly encourages the use of funds for developing the inventory and undertaking the replacement planning. It's important to note here, any project funded must replace the entire lead service line, not just a portion, unless a portion has already been replaced. But these funds can be used to pay for both public and private side lead service line replacements. On PFAS and emerging chemicals, the funding is divided between the drinking water and the clean water state revolving funds. On the drinking water side, the primary focus is on PFAS, but it can also be used for other chemicals on EPA's contaminant candidate list, such as perchlorate, but it cannot be used for a chemical for which there's a national primary drinking water regulation, such as arsenic or nitrate. And again, project activities can include testing, monitoring, project planning, engineering, and design. On the clean water side, this can be PFAS and wastewater, but it can also be emerging contaminants that can include different types of natural or manufactured chemicals, such as those in personal care products, pharmaceuticals, industrial chemicals, pesticides, or microplastics. It cannot be something for which there's water quality criteria. And one thing to note is that there is ongoing EPA rulemaking and regulatory efforts around lead service line replacement as well as PFAS. As of right now, on the lead service line side, the only new requirement is that community water systems must conduct a lead service line inventory by October 2024. But EPA is undergoing a rulemaking, and additional requirements are likely forthcoming around testing, monitoring, placement, notification, et cetera, probably next year. EPA is also undergoing a rulemaking to establish a national primary drinking water regulation for 2 PFAS chemicals, which is also expected next year to set an action level and requirements for testing, monitoring, notification, et cetera. So our recommendation is to get a jump start on any relevant work or projects with this funding that's available now, including through your ARPA funds. And we can go to the next slide.
So here are just some questions to start asking yourself as we hit that 8-month mark, as I mentioned at the start, in the 5 years that the bill's around. And this doesn't just apply to the SRF programs, but to infrastructure more broadly. It's important to understand what your community's needs are so that you can best match those gaps with the programs that are out there. It's also really necessary to think about the timeline, process, and requirements for applying for each of these grants, particularly for competitive grants. We recommend reaching out to NACO or NLC to see what grants that haven't been released yet, but we expect to be released in the next few months, so that you can sort of best position yourself to immediately respond to those notices of funding. I'd also recommend thinking about possible partners that you can leverage. There's a really great opportunity here to partner at the local and the regional level to maximize these dollars and benefits for your communities. With a lot of these build programs, money will flow through the state agencies. So it's really important to reach out to those state offices now, as well as to your neighbors and others who would be involved in these projects. Further, it's really important to make sure that you focus on addressing equity in your infrastructure plans. How can you target investments in small and disadvantaged communities in both urban and rural areas? And how can these funds be used to benefit underserved communities? The administration's really placing a strong emphasis on the Justice 40 initiative, so it's really critical to incorporate equity into your infrastructure plans. And finally, it's important to ask if your team is prepared, your staff's prepared, and sort of what education and resources are needed to access these funds. Understand what sort of technical assistance needs you might have. And like I mentioned, reach out to NACO, reach out to NLC. keep an eye on federal agency pages on the White House website to sort of keep up to date with any resources that come out to help get you up to speed. Next slide.
Great. So a couple of things to specifically think about in terms of your water infrastructure projects. So the first thing is you want to engage and talk with your state agency now, if you haven't already, to understand the timeline and the process. And this will vary by state. I think there was a question in the chat about, what's the timeline in Pennsylvania, or hopefully the next panel will get to that, but it depends. Different states have different timelines. The EPA is expected to start giving out the FY22 SRF funding to the states in a couple of months. So the timeline is now. What is your state definition of disadvantaged communities? And this is really important because it will help you understand if your community qualifies to receive that portion of principal forgiveness or grants. And again, this is a state definition. So does the state definition apply to your community, or does it apply to a portion of your community? If you have a portion that is really particularly a low income side of the community, it may be that part can qualify. If there's a project that is going to benefit that neighborhood, it may be that portion of the project could get qualify for the disadvantaged community grant or principal forgiveness part. I mentioned the EPA memo to the states on SRF implementation. Great idea to read that and kind of know and understand what EPA has told the states how to give out these funds. You want to know what your water infrastructure projects are. Do you have lead pipes? Is Pfas a concern? Start thinking about how you could address those issues now. And how will you use other funding, whether it's your ARPA funds or flood mitigation programs coming out of FEMA like BRIC or pre-disaster hazard mitigation to help with flood control resilience. Again, on the equity and resilience, these are two common themes in bill, but also particularly through EPA and the SRF programs. Think about projects that support a one water approach. This includes supporting climate adaptation, climate smart, climate ready water systems. And finally, use your state municipal leagues and your state county associations as a resource and to help coordinate on that state level for the state specific information. Next slide.
So like I've mentioned a couple of times, we're about over 8 months into the implementation of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. A few months ago, the White House released a map of where some of that initial bill money has gone using an interactive map on their website. And I can drop the link to that in the chat once we're finished. But I recommend checking that map out to just see where that money is flowing. But the White House has put a lot of effort into sort of helping folks find and apply for the programs that best suit their community's needs. A couple of these other resources include a fact sheet outlining, 25 competitive infrastructure funding opportunities for local governments, a detailed guidebook for state and local governments that I really recommend checking out. It lays everything out in a really easy, understandable way. And a briefing book specifically for rural communities that I do recommend that, rural areas take advantage of, since there's a big emphasis on that as well within the bill. And all of these resources can be found at build.gov, which you can see up there on the screen. Next slide.
Okay, and just a few additional EPA resources available here. Let me specifically talk about Buy America, Build America. I think there was a question in the chat on this. So this is a domestic preference program, and as it applies to the SRF, it expands on the iron and steel provisions that you all are probably familiar with if you have SRF projects. This will include construction, materials, and manufactured goods. These are new requirements that will apply to all infrastructure projects across federal agencies, regardless of whether there was specific funding for that program in bill. So it is quite expansive and new. There will be a waiver process. Everything will be consolidated and transparent through the Office of Management and Budget, but each federal agency will have a role to play. So in terms of how does Buy America, Build America apply to water projects? That's EPA. How does it apply to transportation projects? That's DOT. How does it apply to energy projects? That's Department of Energy. So a lot of information is still forthcoming. We hope there is the guidance document from the White House that explains it all, but we are hopeful there will be more resources from OMB, like a fact sheet summary or some Q&A documents. We haven't seen that yet, but hopefully those will be forthcoming. We can go to the next slide. And finally, just some NLC resources to help get you started. We are working closely with the administration to ensure that small and mid-sized communities can access these programs and meet the compliance requirements. Some of this will be through our new local infrastructure hub, which is launching this week. We'll be helping communities understand the opportunities and to apply for 30 key programs that are most suited for local governments. So if you scan the QR code, you'll be taken to our Ready to Rebuild homepage, where you can find our latest webinars, videos, blogs, and more. We have a question form. You can share any questions you have about the law, and we're using it to inform our educational content and our conversations with the federal agencies, which are happening on a regular basis. We want to make sure we're getting the information to you and the resources that you need to be successful with this funding. Next slide.
Also, just to share a few NACO resources, I wanted to take a moment here to plug our really fantastic bill implementation page. And if you scan the QR code there, you'll be taken to it. And this page, and you can see some of it on this slide, includes a matrix of all funding opportunities that counties are directly eligible for, as well as a list of all open notices of competitive funding for county governments. It's really a fantastic resource. It sort of acts as a one-stop shop to see all available competitive bill funding available to counties. It breaks it down by agency, by sub-agency, and lets you know how much funding is available for FY22 for the next 5 years and what it's for. And I think it's really useful because while the agencies giving out this money have tried to make it easy to see what's open, and like I mentioned, that guidebook's really helpful, it's not always in the same place. It's not always clear when things open up or who can apply. So this page really tries to put that information into an understandable and an easy to access format. So I definitely recommend checking that out on the NACO website. Next slide. I think that's it for us. You can see our contact information here, and I believe we are taking questions at the end, but thank you all so much.
Thank you very much for your presentation and sharing the information with everyone today on the call. As a reminder for everyone that is in the webinar, please remember to use the Q&A functions at the bottom of the screen to enter in your questions. This is literally a specific question that you may have, or if you want a presenter to go in depth a little bit more about a particular item or discussion point. I am unable to copy and paste your questions that you're dropping in there into Q&A because I'm moderating it. So I'm putting reminders in for everyone to please copy paste your questions and comments that you want a little bit more detail on into that function, so we do not forget to come back at the end of the sessions to answer your questions for you. If you need assistance with that, feel free to direct message me or share inside the chat function that you need a little bit more assistance, and we'll walk you through that process. Up next, we have a presentation regarding clean water and drinking water with the state revolving funds. We have several presenters that will be on the line today to talk about this. I want to thank Maggie, Carolyn, and Sarah for their time to introduce their sessions and to share the information. Again, we did have some comments in regards to a little bit more information, so that lets you know that what you have shared has been valuable thus far. Up next, we'll hear from Jeff, Brent, and Lauren. Jeff is the Maryland Water Infrastructure Financing Administrator with the Maryland Department of Environment. Brent is the Media and Legislative Affairs Specialist, and Lauren is the Clean Water Financing and Assistance Program. And she works with the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality. So we're going to put their slides onto the screen again. I'm sure I probably butchered some of your presentations. I'm so sorry about that. I'm trying to read in real time and then also introduce you guys. But everyone has really long titles because they're really important and do a lot of great things. So please, if I butchered something, introduce yourself correctly so that everyone knows exactly who we're hearing from today and the experts that we have on the line. Without further ado, I'll pass the mics over to you for your presentation. And again, as a reminder, please put your Q&As in the Q&A function so that way we do not forget that. Thank you again.
Good morning. Thanks for having me. I want to thank LGAC for inviting me to present on today's webinar. My name is Jeff Fretwell. I'm with Maryland Department of Environment and specifically with the Water Infrastructure Financing Administration at Maryland Department of Environment. This slide is just a quick note about our group. We are part of Maryland Department of Environment, which is the state agency that implements the air, land, and water regulatory and permitting programs, largely delegated from EPA. MDE also administers the Clean Water and Drinking Water SRF programs through my group, the Water Infrastructure Financing Administration. We also administer some other state funds like the State Bay Restoration Fund and Comprehensive Flood Management Grant Program. Next slide. So this slide shows Maryland's federal fiscal year 22 SRF BIL funding levels. And I know that's just the acronyms are killer, but it is what it is at this point, I think. So Maryland is receiving through the SRF program 5 different grants for the SRF program. So clean water funding, we have the Clean Water State Revolving Fund General, which is all the eligible uses of the SRF, Clean Water SRF, like Maggie talked about earlier. Maryland's receiving $43 million for that. Clean Water Emerging Contaminants funding, which is all additional subsidy in that column, the second column over, additional subsidy or loan forgiveness. Maryland's receiving $2.26 million in federal fiscal 22 for that. Drinking Water General is $32.9 million. Drinking Water Emerging Contaminants is $13.8 million, and Drinking Water Lead Service Lines is $51.9 million. Those are all the first year allocations to Maryland under the BIL. Next slide, please. So this slide includes a lot of hyperlinks, which obviously you'll have to look at later after the presentation, but I know these are going to be shared with everyone. On this slide, we include information about our priority ranking systems that we use to score applications, and as well as some other documents. We have 2 different scoring systems in Maryland, one for clean water and one for drinking water. We have made some updates to the clean water scoring system in the last couple of years to incorporate things like climate resiliency, flooding considerations, and other co-benefits. We will also be making some additional updates later this year to incorporate additional project types such as wetlands and to align our nutrient crediting with recent updates in our regulatory programs. These updates will be released later in draft form, likely in September for public comments. In addition to the 2 scoring systems, we also have 2 applications we use, one for clean water and one for drinking water. I don't have links to those because we do update them when the application period opens and send them out to our interested parties list. And we do maintain an interested parties list. So if you hear this presentation today and want to be added to our list, please email me, and I'm happy to add anyone who wants to be added to our interested parties list. That's how we keep people updated on our open solicitations, public comment periods, things like that. I also included links to our additional subsidy charts. We have different levels of loan forgiveness or grant based on the type of community you might be in, large or small, disadvantaged or not, in compliance, out of compliance, and then different project types. So all that is outlined in those documents as well. And I've also included a document at the bottom, which is pretty important, which is the prepare to apply document. We do require applicants to have completed some things in order to be eligible for funding, like having their water or sewer project included in the county water and sewer plan is a big one. Next slide, please. So financing terms, and I'm keeping this pretty general, so I'm not getting into the super weeds on any of this, but I'm happy to answer questions or do any follow-up with anyone that has anything specific afterwards. But financing terms, our interest rates for our loans change monthly based on the bond buyer rates. They are below market rate. They're always below market rate. Our current standard rate is 1.6%, and our disadvantaged community rate is 0.8%. We post these updated rates monthly on our website. These have been real low for quite a long time, but as we all know, the interest rates have been going up, and the federal lending rates been going up. So our interest rates have also been going up. We were below 1% for our standard rate for a number of years until recently. The loan terms are based on the useful life of the project being financed, but generally we offer up to 30-year loan terms. And for drinking water projects in disadvantaged communities, we can do up to 40-year loan terms if the useful life would allows for it. And we do charge an administrative fee for all our loans. This is the fee that covers all the operating expenses for our administration to run our program. Next slide, please. So disadvantaged communities, we've talked about this some today, this morning. These are the communities that we target for loan forgiveness in Maryland, which there is a whole lot more loan forgiveness in the BIL. So hence the focus on how states are defining disadvantaged communities and who's eligible for loan forgiveness under the BIL. States do have some flexibility in how they define their disadvantaged communities. In Maryland, we have defined our communities as meeting any of the four of the following. So you don't have to meet all four. Any of the four qualifies you as disadvantaged. The MHI for the community has to be below 70% of statewide MHI, the unemployment in the top 1/3 of the state, declining population in since the last census, or location in an environmental benefits district. In addition to loan forgiveness, disadvantaged communities also get longer loan terms, like I just talked about, and lower interest rates. There was a question in the chat from Rockville, and this kind of gets to that question to a degree. We are looking at updating our disadvantaged community criteria. MDE just released its environmental justice screening tool. I included a hyperlink to it in my presentation. The tool is currently in beta testing mode and open for public comment. The tool is going to be used by the agency in all of its programs, not just funding programs, but we are looking to utilize the tool. And we haven't determined how yet, but to utilize the tool in establishing disadvantaged community definitions and identifying communities for additional subsidy as disadvantaged. What the tool allows us to do, which is different, and this is really, I believe, what Rockville put in the chat, and also we've heard other communities say the same, which is, these utilities are not monoliths. They're not all one thing. They do have areas that are needy within larger areas that maybe are not as needy and don't meet traditional affordability type criteria. So the tool allows us to look at census tract data and generate an environmental justice score based on the census tract data. So I do think there's opportunity there, to help us also be able to provide some additional subsidy assistance to areas that maybe as a whole don't meet some of our criteria, but have areas within their utilities or service areas that do meet the criteria. So I do encourage folks to look at that tool and submit public comments if you look at it and you think there's things that need to be tweaked. But we do plan to utilize that tool, hopefully by the upcoming solicitation in December, once the beta test has been sorted out and the tool is ready to be released in final form. Next slide, please. So this is my last slide, I believe, the status of BIL funding. We did release our draft federal fiscal year 22 funding list for clean water and drinking water SRFs on June 30th. These funding lists include proposed funding levels for projects that applied for funding earlier this year and includes federal fiscal year base SRF funding and federal fiscal year 22 BIL general funds, as well as state grant funds. There are 18 clean water projects and 9 drinking water projects that we propose to receive BIL general funds on this draft funding list. The public comment period is open until July 30th. We will be soliciting for the federal fiscal year 22 lead service line replacement funding, as well as drinking water and clean water emerging contaminants funding, all under the BIL later this summer. We're still in the process of developing those applications and doing outreach related to those specific pots of funding. For federal fiscal year 23 and beyond, to the 23, 24, 25, and 26, BIL funding, all 5 pots, the general, the PFAS, emerging contaminants, and the lead service line funding. We are going to roll those into our annual solicitation. So we have an annual solicitation every year that runs from December 1 to January 31. So starting with this December 1st solicitation, we will be rolling all future BIL funding opportunities into that normal application time period of December 1st to January 31st. And I think the last slide is my contact information. So the email is always the best way to get me, as we all seem to be on our emails all the time. So I appreciate that. Again, I appreciate the opportunity. I'll be checking the Q&A in the chat for questions, and I'm happy to answer any questions later in the Q&A session. Thank you.
Hi, good morning. I'm Brent Sailhammer. I'm part of Pfas, and I'll be representing Pennsylvania today. So there was this presentation has been great so far. It's been a great overview of IIJA and the funding available. What I want to do with my time this morning, and I'll keep it short, is to talk a little bit about how that funding gets implemented as this moves from EPA to the states, and then more specifically, how you can get your hands on that money in Pennsylvania or other states, but we're kind of using the Pennsylvania model here. So I want to do everybody's pretty much covered this so far, and I know the text is pretty small there, but I just wanted to give a quick overview of what Pennsylvania looks like getting their portion of that money. And I know Maggie talked about it a little in her presentation. You can see the 5 buckets of money, the 2 supplementals, the drinking water state revolving fund and the clean water state revolving fund, obviously the 2 biggest pieces. And then we have lead service line replacement fund, and then the emerging contaminants, both in drinking water and clean water. So that makes up the bulk of the BIL or the IIJA funding, in addition to the regular SRF money that we're getting annually. So next slide. So that money, the first year of the 5-year components for IIJA in Pennsylvania brings us about $240 million. So this is a comparison to what we did last year. We did $543 million total last year. So IIJA makes up about a little less than 50% of the entirety of what we did last year. And you can see from this chart where that money went. We did the bulk of those projects were in water and sewer, obviously. And then we did some non-point source projects and some stormwater projects. So the IIJA money is a significant increase in Pennsylvania and every other state. You're going to see a huge bump in funding availability for clean water projects. Next slide. So how will the money get spent? And we've been through this. A number of other folks have already presented on this. Primarily, that funding is going to go to the state revolving funds. And conceptually, that's traditional clean water projects. So that's drinking water lines, wastewater treatment plant upgrades, stormwater improvements, things like that. The normal clean water projects that you see in municipalities and throughout Pennsylvania and other states. Next slide. And then you have these additional programs that are specific to IIJA. You have the lead service lines. This is, folks have talked about this before. Again, obviously, the emerging contaminants, primarily PFAS, PFOA, and some other emerging contaminants. That's in drinking water. And then there's a small slice for wastewater as well. So next slide. All right, so how can I access this funding? And again, this is specific to Pennsylvania. So it's important to understand that each state has their own system, and Jeff talked, he did a great job at discussing how Maryland does their system. So I'm going to talk a little more specifically about Pennsylvania. So again, it's important, if you're not from Pennsylvania, to reach out to your state's SRF administrator and find out what the process is. So in Pennsylvania, PennVest is the administrator for SRF and most of the IIJA funding. Projects are approved. We have a board that makes our financial decisions, our funding award decisions, and that board meets quarterly. So I know, again, this is probably a little small, but you can get a sense of how often the board meets and when they meet. The next meeting is next week, actually. The application cutoff was back in May for July. So when we get an application in the door, PennVest does an initial review of that application, and then we break it up into pieces. We send a portion of that to our DEP, our Department of Environmental Protection, and they make sure that permits are in hand and everything is environmentally qualified. And then another portion to DCED, which is our Department of Community and Economic Development, and they evaluate and rank those projects for the environment or the economic impact it's going to have on the community. So next slide. So all PennVest projects are applied for and processed entirely online. We have really streamlined this process, and this is something that's unique and really, I think, beneficial to applicants, is that you can work through this entire process online. You can go to pennvest.pa.gov. There's a big icon for PV Portal, which is our online application process. You can work through that whole process. You can see where your application is in the review process. You can see what status you have. And you can get a feel for how that process goes online. So you don't have to keep constantly coming in, but we do have other available assistance. So it's important to note that projects must be fully permitted to be approved for funding. Like I said, those projects applications are sent to DEP, and they must sign off on that for any sort of environmental permitting. And then the last bullet here, we do have regional project specialists that work through any issues prior to and following application submittal. So we have a full complement of staff across the Commonwealth. These aren't folks just based in Harrisburg. They're across the Commonwealth. So whatever region you're from, and again, that's tiny. So if you have questions that are specific to a region in Pennsylvania, I'm happy to address that. But we have a staff member in every corner of Pennsylvania who will reach out to you prior to application, work through any questions you have during the application process, work with you to help you submit that application. And then if you get a funding award after the board meeting, they will help you draw that money down and then answer any technical questions you have. So it really is someone who's available, almost like a caseworker for your environmental project. From cradle to grave, that person's going to be available to help you out throughout that whole process. So while I said it's an online process, there's always someone available to help you out with any questions that you have as you're working through that process. So next slide. So most funding awards that come through PennVest, and this includes IIJA, are going to be a mix of mostly loan and grant. And the way we determine that, as you see from the next bullet point there, awards are based on service area demographics. So we assess the entirety of the service area for any water project that we're approving. And we make those awards and based on a number of criteria and demographics in those service areas, primarily unemployment rate and the median household income. Basically, what we're doing is trying to get a sense of the ability of the service area to repay any debt that they might incur as a result of the application and a subsequent loan. So you can see IIJA projects also heavily consider environmental justice communities. You can access the environmental justice community map. I think EPA has a great map. I don't have it offhand, but I can post it in the chat later. So if you're curious where those environmental justice communities are, you can look those up on a GIS map. You can scroll and zoom in really, really easily and find out what portions or what entirety of your community is in an environmental justice area. So most funding covers project costs from design to construction. That's obviously the bulk of the cost for any clean water project is going to be the construction, the actual physical building of those improvements. So next slide. So like I said, a large portion of PennVest funding covers construction-related activities. That is actually really the last piece of a clean water project is, building that improvement. So next slide. However, we do have other funding available before the construction even starts. So for eligible applicants, PennVest also offers funding for what we call phase 2, which is design and engineering. So we call this advanced funding. If folks who have the capacity to incur debt want to apply for that funding and they're eligible, we can certainly make a loan or grant award for folks for design and engineering. So it helps alleviate the burden of that initial cost. I mean, design and engineering can be very, very costly for any project. So we do offer that as an alternative. And then new in 2022, we're starting this in the third quarter. Pfas will also offer phase 1 assistance. So next slide. This is a really, really cool opportunity that we're excited about. We've been working with Pennsylvania's Department of Environmental Protection on this. And we just finalized an RFP to bring in a third-party contractor. So, you know, for years, we've covered the phase 2, the design and engineering, and the construction costs. And now what we're going to do is offer initial technical assistance for prospective projects. So we're going to focus on underserved communities here. And really the idea is to provide feasibility studies, cost analysis, project prioritization, and other, I guess, soft costs is the best way to categorize those. These are these initial studies and analyses for communities and folks who say, you know, I have a project in mind, or I have a project that's a long-term, far away on the horizon. I'm thinking about getting to it, and we're going to need to make these improvements in 5 years or 7 years. What we want to do is be able to offer those tools and those utilities to those folks to get those projects in the pipeline now and say, look, there's like, as Maggie said, this is a once in a lifetime, a once in a generation opportunity to take care of this funding, to take advantage of the funding. So we want to offer all these tools to communities so that you can speed that process up and really take advantage of the funding that's in front of you now. So this third piece, we're really excited about. We're going to launch this in the third quarter. Folks can come in, they can access technical assistance through a third-party contractor, and those folks will really sort through the initial phases of a project so that you can get ready for design and engineering, and you can get ready for construction, and you can take advantage of Pfas funding early and while we have that bulk of the IIJA funding available. So next slide. And that's it. I mean, if you have a project in mind for either the near future or the long term, like I said, now is the time to really take advantage of that. Even if you're not sure whether you want to pull the trigger on a project, contacting Pfas now and reaching out to a project specialist or myself. I can put my contact information in the chat, reaching out to someone at Pfas and saying, this is the project we're thinking of. We're really not ready, or we are ready. Can you help us figure out what's the best way to move forward? Should we move forward now, or should we wait? The answer is always to move forward now because of the IIJA funding. So we can help you work through those projects and those logistics for the projects. So like I said, I'll put my contact information in the chat. If you have any questions, feel free to ask, but that's the end for me.
All right, good morning, everyone. I think I'm going to round us out for the states here. My name is Lauren Linville. I'm the Program Coordinator for the Virginia Clean Water Revolving Loan Fund, and I'm pleased to join you today to talk about Bill and specifically what the plans are for Bill in Virginia. Next slide, please. So I only have 11 slides, but still wanted to give you a bit of an outline of what we'll talk about today, also to keep me on track. So we'll talk about the bill specifics in Virginia, like how the funds will be offered and the newer pots of money that Bill provides. And then I'll also cover the project types and eligibilities that are specific to Virginia and some examples of those projects. Next slide, please. Okay, so as Maggie covered in her overview, bill funding for clean water projects is going to flow through the Clean Water State Revolving Loan Funds. So in Virginia, that's managed by the Department of Environmental Quality, and our team at DEQ here in Richmond is called the Clean Water Financing Assistance Program. And so that program manages the SRF, but also several other clean water programs. So I'll quickly go through those for any of our partners on the line who aren't familiar. So we have the Clean Water State Revolving Loan Fund. We also have the Stormwater Local Assistance Fund, or SLAF. And SLAF helps provide grant funding for projects like stream restorations or stormwater BMPs. The Water Quality Improvement Fund, or WQIF, provides grants for nutrient reduction technology at publicly owned wastewater facilities, and then can also fund some wastewater conveyance projects. And then we also have the American Rescue Plan Act, ARPA funds that are under, or that we're administrating. Those are grant funds to address combined sewer overflows and centralized and decentralized wastewater projects in Virginia. When those funds were given to DEQ to administer, the General Assembly put some very specific uses on those funds. And so if you're interested in that, you can go to our website and learn more. So that's what our team manages here. The two that you see highlighted in green, those are federal sources of funding, and those in blue are state sourced funding. But for the purposes, the most pertinent information on this slide in regards to this webinar is that bill funding allocated to Virginia is going to flow through the CW RLF. Next slide, please. So, what does that mean for your locality in Virginia? So to access bill funding, you need to apply through the RLF solicitation process, which is open now. We began accepting applications on June 6th, and the process will close on Friday, July 29th. That information is up on our website, and I have a link at the bottom here and put it in the chat for y'all. But once the applications closed or accepted, we take about 4 months to review, approve. We issue a tentative authorization somewhere in the middle of that process. But ultimately, we have to take our funding recommendations to the State Water Control Board for their approval, which would happen in late November. So we would notify folks in December if they've been selected for funding. Virginia's SRF, we don't have a minimum loan amount, there's no maximum, and there's no matching requirements for localities. Historically, in Virginia, we have leveraged our funding from EPA to ensure we are able to authorize all of the applications we receive, as long as those are for applications. Those are applications for projects that are eligible for funding. And bill funding, we don't anticipate that changing that. So for reference, last year we received 48 applications, and of those 48, 40 received some sort of principal forgiveness, ranging from 10% to 100% of the loan amount. And in recent years, the total principal forgiveness has been around $7 million annually for all projects across the state. But this year, because of bill, solely because of bill, we authorized $20 million in principal forgiveness in Virginia. So quite a big step up there. Next slide, please. So assuming that you apply for the loan, you'd probably be interested in having as much of that loan forgiven as possible, or that principal forgiven as possible. So this is how Virginia figures out who gets principal forgiveness. We use our affordability criteria, and we consider principal forgiveness based on high water quality benefits of the project, and then the hardship of the locality for those projects, and those projects may be otherwise unaffordable. And so to qualify for principal forgiveness, we evaluate the locality using the affordability criteria, and these 3 criteria: median household income, which is used to determine the reasonable sewer cost per household. And then we compare that reasonable sewer cost to the actual sewer cost in order to assign points. We also look at unemployment rate of the locality in relation to the state's unemployment rate, and then population trends. So as population decreases, we award more, of those 10 points. Population increases, fewer points. But altogether, the more points that a locality receives usually equates to a higher principal forgiveness percentage. And again, principal forgiveness will only be accessible through a CWSRF loan application. Next slide, please. So then what's the difference in Virginia with bill? The headline for localities is that we have more principal forgiveness. Everything else about accessing the project funding, it's the same solicitation process at the same time of year. Our evaluation criteria for affordability as of right now is staying the same. We do have, I saw Grace from Virginia put in our EJ screen tool in the chat. So that is one tool that Virginia uses that may eventually come into play if we reevaluate our criteria. But for this solicitation process right now, the affordability criteria I shared is what we plan to use. Otherwise, everything's staying pretty much the same. So bill funding came with more than just additional principal forgiveness opportunities. There are newer pots of funding for technical assistance and for emerging contaminants. And in addition, bills, the EPA's implementation memo to the states regarding bill put an emphasis on building resiliency. And so these are all areas and priorities initiatives that Virginia is excited to develop, but specifically in regards to the TA program. So in Virginia, we'll have about $1.2 million to award, but our first step is developing a program that meets the needs of our communities. So to that end, we have a 5-step plan that we will be implementing over the course of this year to develop that TA program. So it's going to start with outreach, to gain information, to analyze, develop a plan, and then put that plan out for public comment before we finalize it. So a key point here is that if you are not already receiving emails from DEQ specific to the Clean Water Financing Assistance Program, please email me. My information will be on the last slide, and I'd be happy to add you to our distribution list so that you can participate in that TA development process. Virginia is still working out our plans for the emerging contaminant funding, and as well as any assistance or resources around resiliency efforts through the RLF. So there will be more to come on that as we develop it. So getting on that email list is a great way to keep up with us. Next slide, please. So in Virginia, if you're a Virginia locality or a partner interested in applying for the revolving loan fund, your project has to fall into one of these categories: land conservation, stormwater, wastewater, brownfields, and living shorelines. We are limited by Virginia code to those specific project types. So EPA and federally, there's a broader spectrum of projects eligible. In Virginia, we're limited to these. So next slide, please. Here are some examples of projects we authorized on our project priority list last year, or for this coming year, for assistance. So we're looking at sanitary sewer lines, 2 wastewater projects, so a sewer line replacement and plant upgrades. The city of Lynchburg, we have a stormwater project that is going to remove a dam and then do some stream restoration work. And then we have a local program with the Middle Peninsula PDC to administer a loan program, loans for living shoreline projects and septic repairs and installations on private property. So what's the bottom line? If you take nothing from this presentation, is that if you're a Virginia locality or you want to do a project in Virginia, you need to go through the Clean Water Revolving Loan Fund to access the bill funding. And it's, as of right now, we're using the same solicitation process that we usually do, which is open now until July 29th. And we're using our existing affordability criteria for this cycle. And then we really do want as much feedback as possible on the technical assistance needs in Virginia so we can develop a robust program that meets the needs of our communities. So please make sure you're looped in with us so that we can work with you on that. Next slide, please. And so this is my phone number. Here's my email. That link there is to our website, which is updated very regularly with information about our programs. And I encourage you to reach out to us. And I will check the chat for questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for your presentations. I know that we heard a lot this morning in regards to steps we can take to improve our water infrastructure. We've been trying to track some of the questions and comments in the chat box to make sure we go back and address them. We have several presenters that may not be here for the Q&A, but they have welcomed anyone to reach out to them to answer questions post the webinar. Again, this information will be shared with you to use at your leisure at the end of today's events. I want to thank everyone again for joining us. We are going to jump into Q&A momentarily, but just want to do a virtual round of applause to all of our presenters that we had joining us this morning. Can we please drop some thank yous in the chat box for them for sharing a lot of nuggets of information and things that we can take forth and use in our localities or other places that we are trying to do the work to support the Bay. The webinar will be posted on YouTube and a link will be sent out to those who registered to be able to get that information. We see a lot of claps coming in to the chat. So please know that everyone does appreciate you being here and helping to share information. I'm going to go to the Q&A box to make sure we address those questions. And again, we have others in here that are also moderating. I know there's at least 3 questions that we need to go back and talk about in particular. So the first question that we have is, I believe is for Maggie, or the question is for Brian. Are the charts or the funds that were presented for the Chesapeake Bay region, or were they statewide? And again, if I'm not asking the question correctly, please clarify. This is from Ms. Verna Harrison. So I believe the question was for Brian. Are the charts?
I think they meant Brent.
Brent, okay.
Because it came in just as Brent was making his presentation. Okay. Yes.
Brent, okay. So were the charts? Yeah.
Yeah, our charts were just that's Pennsylvania. That's statewide.
Okay. Statewide. So Ms. Werner, please drop in the chat if that answers your question, or do we need to circle back to that? The next question we have is from Alexa. Is the Developing VA Technical Assistance Program run through or hired by the DEQ, conservation districts, etc.?
Hi, I was just answering it in the chat. So we have not yet developed the TA program. So therefore we haven't committed to a specific delivery method or, which agencies or partners will be responsible for providing it. But if you do have a preference or you have an idea about what would be an effective way to do that and accessible for your community, we want to hear from you. So you can send that to me directly, and then again, make sure we can include you in our outreach process for the TA program development.
Thank you very much. Our next question that we have is from Ann. In Virginia, is the TA intended to help localities that don't have grant application staff to apply for funding?
That's certainly a form that it could take. And if that is a need that we hear from communities, we would be open to helping them meet that need so that they can apply through the SRF, but we haven't yet decided. So yeah, send it in. We'll consider it as a need for the TA program.
Next question, in Virginia, when will applications for the DWSRF program be open?
I do not know that. I only work on the clean water side. In Virginia, they're split, and the drinking water SRF is managed by our Department of Health. So I would need to look into that. Maybe Maggie knows that.
I tell you what, I will make sure that I put the Virginia Department of Health's website in the answer to the question. I was hoping you would know off the top of your head, Lauren, but that's okay. I'll look it up as we're talking. I'll get the answer there.
Okay. For regular SRF money, is there a way to guarantee a community that will? Is there a way to guarantee a community that the loan will be forgiven? The person also mentioned, I've heard that some communities are reluctant to take the SRF fund without the certainty of knowing that the loan will be forgiven.
The best or quickest way to do that is to reach out to your state SRF. If you're concerned about taking the time to put in a full application You can talk to them about your condition, but those determinations really cannot be made without a complete understanding of what the project costs are going to be, as well as provide the financial information that's going to be needed to evaluate the community's affordability. So
Okay,
it's not just a simple, well, we want a loan for $1 million. Can we get principal forgiveness? That's not enough information to make a quick determination like that.
and this might be a follow-up to that. It was in the chat. So do localities need to qualify for the SRF loan and have the ability to repay it before accessing principal forgiveness? How does this benefit localities that can't qualify for the initial loan? And again, your answer might still be the
oh,
same. I think it's a different concern.
Okay, if you cannot afford to repay the loan, how can I say this? It's all one like unit of decision. So based on the state's affordability, if you cannot afford to repay the loan, then you're going to be able to get principal forgiveness, right? If it's that you want principal forgiveness as opposed to need principal forgiveness, that's a different conversation. Okay. All right.
Yes.
I hope that gets
It does give clarity. And if not, then everyone will have your contact information after the webinar that can reach out to get a little bit more understanding. But for me, it does provide a little bit more context. There are 3 more questions that I'm aware of. This is earlier on in the presentations. I think there was a slide said lead was only 49% forgiveness.
Yes.
Could you clarify? Mhm.
Yes, I did see that in the chat. The slide is correct. The lead service line money, 49% of that must be provided, but it's also 0 state match for the lead service line.
Okay.
So it's 5 buckets and they're all going around in my head. So,
Okay.
all right. Thank you.
Allison wrote, can the speakers talk about Buy America requirements that are part of the BIL? I believe a little bit was covered on that. So Allison, while I go to the next question, please drop in the chat if you do have a follow-up with that, or do you still need a little bit more clarity? We do have another question from Jim in the Q&A. What sources of funding is being used to hire third parties to provide technical assistance on developing project concepts, prioritization, etc.? Also, do third parties assist with grant applications?
Right, I'm going to take that one. One of my early slides explained that this is also an authorization statute. And one of the things that Congress completely changed was they gave the states the authority to use 2% of their federal grant funds to provide technical assistance. That's brand new in the Clean Water SRF. It has always been there for the Drinking Water SRF. And yes, completing applications is part of one of the eligibilities of that technical assistance. And as Virginia is still trying to scope out exactly what they're going to be offering with this money. And I know Pennsylvania has already gone with an RFP to hire an outside contractor to help them provide that technical assistance. In addition to all of that, there is separate funding through EPA to set up various types of technical assistance, but we are still working on that process. That's not yet done. But again, on the last link on my slide was to everything related to bill. You'll see things posted there. Right.
Okay. I think we answered all the questions that were in the Q&A. We do have a few more minutes, so I just want to make sure that we're capturing everyone's initial feedback and questions. For the presenters that are still on the line, I know you guys are answering questions in real time. While we wait for a few more to trickle in, was there any question that we did not say out loud? Because there was at least 20 questions before I started this that you found might be valuable for everyone to really be aware of in terms of the responses you provided. If not, Someone said, I hope this isn't creating a new question, but I cannot see the CC, but no worries. I'm not really sure what that's referring to. We'll double check on that while we're waiting. What is the timeline to apply for the SRF, or is it continuous?
Hey, Jasmine, I'll take that one really quick. Each state has its own process. Some states are continuous. I thought I had typed the response to this. Pennsylvania is continuous as an example, but then they just have cutoff periods for each board meeting, right? But you can always submit an application. Maryland's normal solicitation process, when I say normal, I mean pre-bill, was December 1st to the end of January, right? And then it's every year. So if you've missed the cutoff period for any states, you can always still submit that application for the next funding cycle. All right. I hope that answers the question. And I know Delaware has 2 separate solicitations each year. In addition, Maryland is now doing a separate solicitation that's just about to start for their emerging contaminant funding and their lead service line funding. So don't miss that opportunity. And then I think Jeff mentioned that they're going to then get all of the bill funding for the future years wrapped into the normal solicitation process that starts December 1st.
Okay. We have one last question. Someone said, don't miss the question related to projects across state lines. So let me just make sure I'm tracking what that one is. I think there was a question earlier about.
I thought I must be doing something wrong because I could have sworn I typed in the response to that. Yes, we have done that plenty of times in just here in Region 3, right? Where you have a treatment plant that's in one state, but part of their collection system is in another state, right? So the state managers in EPA Region 3 work very closely together. They know each other very well. So the only downside that I see is that the local government or utility will probably have to submit 2 applications, 1 to each state, right? So then they would work together to figure out the costs associated with each portion of the project to get the full project funded. Right.
Okay, so this one last question that came in. I think it's a good one due to the comments in the chat in regards to looking at philanthropic ways to pay for projects. If communities can be assured of principal forgiveness, if they can't meet initial qualifications for a loan, would they need philanthropic funds to get them qualified? Question. Where would those funds be best applied?
Okay, there's a lot in that question.
Yes.
All right. I can't say this enough. Please contact your state SRF manager. All right. Don't let the fact that you don't know how you're going to repay the loan stop you from applying for the project. Getting money to a project, there are a lot of steps in the process, and the states are there to work with you and get the project funded. The higher the priority of the project, the more the state is going to be working with you to get the funding identified. In addition to the money from SRF, there is a lot of other federal and state funding available out there too. They will find a way, if you're willing to work with them, they'll find a way to get any eligible project funded.
Thank you. I think we will wrap here because I think you end on a really good note. There's no other open questions inside the Q&A box. I think the key to what you shared today and all the other presenters is to get involved at the state level first, to figure out what your options are and to understand the means in which you can find funding, technical assistance, etc. for your projects. A lot of people have shared different links inside the chat box. Grab them while you can, but other information will be shared after the webinar. And the presentations, contact information will be provided to you. Want to take a moment to thank everyone again for joining us this morning, but most importantly, want to thank our sponsors. We have NLC, NACO, VML, VACO, MML, and MACO. All of the alphabet soup has been represented today in regards to the watershed and helping to assist with infrastructure in the Bay. We're looking forward to continuing projects like this. I also want to thank the Bay staff, Ms. Jennifer Starr and Ms. Ola Imani, for helping to organize this along with their partners to be able to put this on together for everyone. So before we leave out, just want to do another virtual clap for everyone who participated in organizing this and spreading the word for this. Please be advocates and ambassadors for LGAC and all of our other sister advisory groups as we work to promote resources and information to help you with your projects. So if this happens again or another group has a webinar or some type of outreach activity, please be sure to share it with your networks as well so we can help spread the word, but then most importantly, hear back from you about what's needed so that way we can be responsive. I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day. We do appreciate your time and thank you again for all the work that you do to support the Bay.